When I married Michael, I truly believed I'd found someone who loved me for who I was. He was warm, funny, and down to earth, the complete opposite of the world I grew up in. I wanted peace, a simple life, and real love, not the constant pressure that came with my family's wealth. With Michael, I thought I had that. At first, things were good. We had a small house in Georgia, surrounded by quiet streets and friendly neighbors. I cooked, cleaned, and worked part-time at a local bookstore. Michael worked long hours, but we always found time for each other. I felt happy, content, and ready to build a family. But slowly, his mother, Margaret, started showing me who she really was. She came by often, uninvited, pretending to help but always criticizing. She'd walk into the kitchen, lift the lid off a pot, and say things like, "We don't cook food like this in our family." If I bought something new for the house, she'd call it showing off. She had this way of making me feel like an outsider, like I didn't belong. I tried to win her over, bringing her flowers, inviting her to dinner, asking for her advice. But nothing worked. She didn't want peace, she wanted control. And slowly, she started turning Michael against me. At first, it was small. He'd repeat her comments like, "Mom says you don't really fit in here." Or, "You should try to be a bit more like her." I would laugh it off, but deep down it hurt. The man who used to hold my hand and tell me I was perfect the way I was, now looked at me like I was a problem to fix. When I got pregnant, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe a grandchild would soften her heart. But instead, she became worse. She questioned every decision I made. What I ate, how much I rested, even how I planned to raise my baby. And Michael just let her. After Noah was born, I was exhausted but happy. All I wanted was for us to be a family. But Margaret made sure that peace didn't last. She accused me of spending too much money, said I was using her son. Michael started to believe her lies. I could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the distance. One night, they both confronted me in the living room. Margaret's voice was sharp, her words cutting. She called me a gold digger. Michael stood beside her, silent at first, then finally said the words that shattered me. "Maybe she's right." In that moment, I realized I had no place there. I didn't beg or argue. I just held my baby close, walked out the door, and left behind the life I thought was real. I didn't know where I was going that night, but I knew one thing: they would regret it. And when they finally saw who I really was, it would already be too late. At the start of our marriage, life felt calm and full of hope. Michael and I had a small home with a porch where we'd drink coffee every morning before work. We didn't have much, but we had each other, or at least that's what I believed. For the first few months, we laughed a lot, took long drives, and dreamed about our future. I thought we were unbreakable. But Margaret, his mother, didn't see our marriage the same way. From the moment we returned from our honeymoon, she began showing up without warning. Sometimes she'd say she was just checking in, but most of the time, it felt more like she was checking up on me. If she saw dust on a table, she'd make a comment. If dinner wasn't ready when she arrived, she'd sigh and say, "In this house, we eat on time." I tried to be polite. I offered her tea, smiled through her criticism, and reminded myself she was family. But deep down, her presence started to wear me down. She'd walk around my kitchen like she owned it and question every little thing I did. "Why do you cook like that?" she'd ask. "Michael likes things the way I make them." No matter how hard I tried to please her, she always found something wrong. At first, Michael would tell me not to take her words seriously. "That's just Mom," he'd say with a shrug. But slowly, he started listening to her more than to me. If she said the food wasn't good, he'd agree. If she hinted that I wasn't managing the house well, he'd suggest I try harder. The man who once told me I was perfect the way I was had started to see me through her eyes. I noticed small changes in him. The way he stopped holding my hand when she was around, how his voice became colder when we argued. He'd come home late and spend more time talking to her on the phone than to me. I began to feel like a guest in my own marriage. When I found out I was pregnant, I was overjoyed. I thought this baby might bring us together again, that maybe a grandchild would soften Margaret's heart. But instead, she became even more controlling. She started showing up almost every day, telling me what I should or shouldn't eat, how I should sleep, and what kind of mother I should be. Michael started to take her side more openly. If I disagreed with her, he'd say, "Mom just wants the best for you." But it didn't feel like that. It felt like I was being slowly pushed out of my own life. I tried to stay strong. I told myself that once the baby arrived, things would get better. Maybe Michael would see how much I loved our family, how much I was trying. I prayed for peace, not just for me, but for our child. But deep down, a quiet fear grew inside me. What if nothing changed? What if the man I loved was already gone, replaced by someone who no longer saw me as his partner, but as a mistake? When Noah was born, I thought things might finally get better. Holding my baby for the first time made everything else fade away. The tension, the hurt, the loneliness. For a moment, it felt like my world had meaning again. But that peace didn't last. The moment we came home from the hospital, Margaret was there, ready to take control. She acted like she was helping, but every word felt like another cut. She criticized how I held the baby, how I fed him, even how I changed his clothes. "You're doing it wrong," she'd say, snatching the baby from my arms. I wanted to scream, but I stayed quiet for Noah's sake. I kept thinking if I stayed calm, she'd eventually back off. But she never did. My body was still healing, and I could barely sleep, but Margaret didn't care. She called me lazy when I didn't get up fast enough, and spoiled when I hired a part-time nanny to help with Noah during the day. I wasn't trying to avoid motherhood, I just needed rest. But in her eyes, everything I did was wrong. Michael started drifting away even more. At first, he said he was working late, but I knew better. He was spending more time at his mother's house than at ours. When he did come home, he barely spoke to me. If I tried to talk about how I felt, he'd shut me down with the same cold words. "Mom's just trying to help. Stop overreacting." The house felt empty, even when he was there. I spent my days alone with Noah, whispering promises to him that I'd make his life better someday. At night, I'd sit in the nursery, rocking him to sleep, pretending I didn't hear the arguments coming from downstairs when Margaret stayed over. One evening, things finally broke. Margaret came over without warning, like always. She looked around the house, her eyes full of judgment. I had toys scattered on the couch and baby clothes drying near the window. I was tired, running on maybe 2 hours of sleep. She crossed her arms and said sharply, "You only married my son for money." I froze. My hands were shaking as I tried to hold back tears. "Margaret, that's not true," I said softly. "I've never asked your son for a single thing." But she didn't listen. She turned to Michael, who was standing beside her, silent as always, and said, "She's using you. Just like I told you." I looked at him, waiting for him to defend me, to say something, anything. But all he did was sigh and look away. That silence hurt more than her words ever could. My voice cracked as I said, "I don't need your money, Margaret." I never did. But by then, it didn't matter. They had already made up their minds. That night, after they both went to bed, I sat by Noah's crib, tears quietly running down my face. I realized I was fighting a battle I could never win. And for the first time, I started thinking that maybe leaving was the only way to save myself and my son. A week after that terrible argument, I was still recovering from childbirth. My body hurt, I was barely sleeping, and I was doing everything I could to care for Noah on my own. Michael had become distant, barely speaking to me except when it was something cold or critical. I tried to reach out, to remind him that we were supposed to be a team, but it was like he had already decided I didn't belong anymore. One evening, I was sitting on the couch feeding Noah when Michael came home. His face looked different, hard, closed off. He didn't sit down or ask about the baby. He just stood there, staring at me. I could feel that something bad was coming, but I stayed quiet, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he said the words that broke me. "My mom was right. You're not good for this family." At first, I thought I'd misheard him. I looked up, hoping he'd take it back, but he didn't. He just kept talking, saying things like how I'd changed, how I wasn't the same woman he married. I wanted to ask him when he stopped seeing me, when I became the problem instead of his partner, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me speak. Then he said something that made me feel completely numb. "I think it's better if you leave. Mom and I have talked about it, and it's what's best for everyone." I sat there in silence for a few seconds, unable to believe he was serious. I had just given birth. I was weak, tired, and holding our newborn in my arms. Yet he stood there, expressionless, as if throwing me out was an easy decision. I asked softly, "Where am I supposed to go, Michael?" He shrugged and said, "I'm sure you'll figure something out." Those words echoed in my mind as I packed a small bag with one hand and held Noah with the other. I didn't have the strength to argue or fight. I just moved quietly, tears running down my cheeks, while he sat at the table scrolling through his phone. When I stepped outside, the night was cold, and the air felt heavy. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house where I thought I'd build my family, and realized it had never truly been mine. I walked down the road, holding Noah close, whispering to him that everything would be okay even though I didn't believe it yet. I found a small motel nearby and used the little money I had left to pay for a room. Inside, the air smelled old and the lights flickered, but it was shelter. I laid Noah on the bed, watching him sleep peacefully, unaware of the storm around us. I sat beside him, too tired to cry anymore. That night, as I stared at the ceiling, I realized I'd been living my life, trying to please people who never saw my worth. I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't beg to be loved again. I would rebuild, not for revenge, but for my son and for me. And one day, the people who cast me out would see the woman they tried to break standing taller than ever. When I left Georgia, I had no plan, just a baby, a few bags, and a heart full of pain. I used the last of my money to buy a bus ticket to New York, the only place I could think to go. My father, Richard Carter, lived there. We hadn't spoken much in years because I'd wanted to prove I could build a life on my own. But as I looked down at Noah sleeping in my arms, I knew I had to swallow my pride. When I arrived at his office, I almost turned around. I was embarrassed, afraid he'd look at me with disappointment. But when the doors opened and he saw me, tired, worn out, and holding his grandson, his face softened immediately. He didn't ask questions or judge me. He just wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "You don't owe them an explanation, sweetheart, but you owe yourself a comeback." That night, sitting at his penthouse, I told him everything. How Michael and Margaret had treated me, how they kicked me out when I needed them most. He listened quietly, his eyes full of pain and anger, but he didn't say much. When I finished, he looked at Noah and said, "You're not starting over alone this time." A few weeks later, he asked me to come work with him again. Not as a favor, but as his equal. "You've always had a sharp mind," he said. "Use it. Build something for yourself." I hesitated at first. I didn't want people to think I was just the boss's daughter, but he reminded me of who I really was. A Carter, someone who knew how to build, lead, and rise again. So I said yes. The first few months were hard. I was balancing work and motherhood, waking up early for feedings and staying up late with reports. But slowly, things began to fall into place. My father trusted me with big projects, and soon, I was running major branches of the company. My ideas brought in new investors, expanded markets, and opened doors across multiple states. Every success made me stronger, and every challenge reminded me that I was no longer the broken woman who left Georgia in tears. Noah grew up watching me work. Every time I looked at him, I remembered why I was doing it. Not for revenge, but to create a future where no one could take our peace again. My father often told me how proud he was. "You've turned your pain into power," he'd say. And he was right. 2 years later, the company had grown beyond anything my father ever imagined. Reporters wrote about the Carter expansion, calling it one of the biggest success stories in real estate. I kept a low profile, rarely doing interviews. I didn't need attention. My work spoke for itself. And deep inside, I knew the day would come when the people who broke me would learn who I truly was. But this time, I wouldn't need to say a word. My success would do the talking. Back in Georgia, Michael's world slowly began to crumble. At first, things seemed fine for him. He still had his job, his mother by his side, and the same house we once shared. But soon, cracks started to show, the kind that come when truth and pride finally catch up to you. The company Michael worked for began cutting staff, and his name was one of the first on the list. He tried to act confident, saying he'd find something better soon, but months passed, and no one was hiring. His savings started disappearing quickly, and bills piled up faster than he could handle. Margaret's health also started declining. Years of bitterness and stress took their toll. She became weaker, needing medication and constant care. Michael tried to take care of her, but without a steady income, it was almost impossible. Their fights grew worse. She blamed him for losing his job, and he blamed her for ruining everything with her constant meddling. What neither of them knew was that the house they lived in, the one they thought Michael bought, had actually been saved by me. I had quietly paid the down payment before everything fell apart, because I wanted us to have a stable place to raise our child. But after I left, no one was there to cover the rest. Without my payments, the bank finally stepped in. One morning, Michael came home to find a foreclosure notice on the front door. The house he'd once kicked me out of no longer belonged to him. They were forced to move into a small apartment on the edge of town. The neighbors weren't friendly, and the noise made Margaret miserable. Michael spent his days sitting in front of his laptop, applying for jobs he was never called for. At night, he'd drink and stare at old photos, the ones where I was still smiling beside him. One afternoon, after yet another rejection email, he opened a job post online for a management position at a real estate company in New York, Carter and Company. The name sounded familiar, but he didn't think much of it. He assumed it was just another big corporation. Desperate, he sent in his resume, barely expecting to hear back. 2 days later, he received a call from the company. The woman on the line said his background matched the role they were hiring for and invited him for an in-person interview in New York. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful. He told Margaret the news that evening, and she nearly cried from relief. "See," she said weakly, "maybe our luck is turning around." Michael smiled for the first time in months. "Yeah," he said, "maybe it is." He didn't know that the opportunity he thought would save him was leading him right back to the person he had destroyed, and that the woman waiting for him in that New York office wasn't just the CEO of the company. She was the wife he once threw out into the night with their newborn son. The morning of the interview, Michael woke up earlier than he had in months. He ironed his shirt twice, polished his old shoes, and rehearsed what he would say in front of the mirror. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe his life was turning around. This was his chance to start fresh, a good job at a respected company in New York. He didn't know much about Carter and Company, but everything about it sounded promising. He arrived at the building just before noon. The glass tower stood tall and shining in the middle of Manhattan, its logo carved elegantly on the front doors. Inside, the lobby looked like something out of a movie: marble floors, gold accents, and a quiet hum of success in the air. He felt small walking through it, but he straightened his back, reminding himself that he still had experience, that he could prove his worth. A young assistant greeted him and led him upstairs to the executive floor. "Mrs. Carter will see you shortly," she said with a polite smile before leaving him alone in a long hallway filled with photos of the company's milestones. Michael looked at one framed newspaper headline that read, "Carter and Company expands across 12 states under new leadership." He wondered who this new leader was. Moments later, the assistant returned and opened the tall glass doors to a spacious office. "You can go in," she said. Michael stepped inside, clutching his resume. The room was bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He took a few steps forward and froze. Behind the large oak desk sat a woman in a crisp white suit, her hair tied neatly, confidence radiating from her posture. She looked up and their eyes met. His heart stopped. "Emily?" he stammered, his voice cracking. She smiled slightly, calm and composed. "Hello, Michael." He blinked, unable to process what he was seeing. You work here?" Emily stood up slowly, picking up a folder from her desk. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Then she held the folder out and said in a steady voice, "I don't work here, Michael. I run this company." For a moment, everything went silent. Michael's mouth fell open, but no words came out. He looked around the office again, as if hoping this was some kind of mistake. But the name on the plaque near the door read Emily Carter, CEO. His eyes darted back to her, and she met his stare without flinching. There was no anger in her face, no trace of the woman who once cried in front of him. She was steady, powerful, and completely out of his reach. He finally managed to whisper, "I didn't know." "I know," she said softly. "You never cared to." The silence that followed was heavier than anything either of them could say. Michael's shoulders slumped as the truth settled in. The woman he'd once thrown away was now the one with the power to decide his future. And for the first time, he realized what real loss felt like. Michael stood in front of Emily's desk, his hands shaking slightly. The silence between them felt endless. He opened his mouth once, twice, but no words came out. Finally, he blurted, "Emily, please just let me explain." She didn't say anything at first. Her face was calm, unreadable, the kind of calm that made him even more nervous. He took a step forward, desperate. "It wasn't all my fault," he said quickly. "My mom, she twisted everything. She made me believe things about you that weren't true. I was stupid, I listened to her. But I didn't mean to hurt you." Emily slowly sat back in her chair, folding her hands neatly on the desk. Her eyes stayed on him, clear and steady. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" she repeated softly. "You told me to leave our home, Michael. You threw me out with a newborn in my arms. That wasn't your mother's voice, that was yours." Michael's throat tightened. I know I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought you'd married me for money. I thought you didn't care about me." She let out a quiet sigh. "And now," he looked down at the floor, ashamed. "Now I see how wrong I was. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. I lost everything after you left. Please, Emily, just give me one more chance. I'll prove it to you. Emily's expression didn't change. One more chance, she said slowly. You had every chance, Michael. When I needed love, you gave me doubt. When I needed support, you turned your back. And now you're standing here because you need something from me. He looked at her helplessly. That's not true. It is, she interrupted quietly. You didn't believe in me when I needed you most. Now you believe in me because you need me. Her words hit harder than he expected. He swallowed, trying to find something to say, but nothing came. Emily stood up, closing the file with his name on it. I don't hold hate for you, she said calmly. But I don't owe you anything anymore. Just then, her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen. It was a call from Margaret. She hesitated a moment before answering. On the other end, Margaret's voice cracked through the speaker, full of tears. Emily, please, she begged. My son made a mistake. He's been punished enough. Please help him. Just give him a job, a chance, something. Don't destroy him like this. Emily looked at Michael, who stood frozen, eyes full of regret. Her voice stayed soft but firm as she replied, Tell your son I wish him well, but not in my world. She ended the call, placed the phone down, and turned back to Michael. For a moment, she almost looked sad, but only for what once was. Then she walked toward the window, her back straight, her voice steady. Goodbye, Michael. He stood there, speechless, knowing this time there would be no coming back. The woman he once doubted had become the kind of person he could never reach again. Emily didn't seek revenge through anger or hate. She didn't plan to ruin Michael's life or expose what he had done. She had already learned that peace was the best kind of victory. Still, she couldn't ignore what he had done to her and their son. He deserved to face the consequences, not through cruelty, but through truth. When Michael's job application came through, Emily made a decision. She didn't reject him outright. Instead, she sent a quiet message to her HR department. A week later, Michael received a job offer, a small position in one of the company's rural branches, far from the main office. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much, but it was work. He accepted it right away, unaware that Emily had personally approved the offer. He thought maybe fate was giving him a chance to start over. But what he didn't know was that Emily's new vice president, David Turner, knew every detail of what had happened. David had been by Emily's side since her return, helping her grow the company. And when he saw Michael's name come across his desk, he smiled knowingly. Let's see how he handles reporting to people who once envied her, David said quietly. Emily only nodded. He'll learn what respect really means. Michael's new job was nothing like what he expected. He had to follow orders, meet tight deadlines, and take instructions from people who were years younger than him. Every time he tried to use his charm, no one cared. Every time he tried to complain, his supervisors reminded him that this company had strict standards, standards Emily had helped create. Back in New York, Emily didn't spend time thinking about him. Her life was full now, filled with purpose, love, and laughter. Little Noah had grown into a bright, happy child. Each morning, she'd drop him off at preschool before heading to the office. There was no tension, no shouting, no walking on eggshells. Just peace. Sometimes, late at night, Emily would think about how everything had come full circle. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't fought, she had simply lived better. And that was enough. Her success, her calm, her happiness. Those were the things that spoke louder than revenge. When she saw Michael's quarterly report come across her desk months later, she didn't feel triumph. She just felt closure. He was working hard, struggling to adjust, and learning humility one task at a time. Margaret called once more, asking for another chance to talk. Emily politely declined. There's nothing left to say, she told her assistant. As she watched Noah play with his toy cars on the living room rug that evening, Emily smiled softly. Her revenge had never been about payback. It was about freedom. She had built a life where her son would grow up surrounded by love, not judgment. And that, to her, was the sweetest form of justice, not loud, not cruel, but graceful and final. 3 years later, life looked completely different for Emily. Her company had grown stronger than ever, expanding into cities she once only dreamed of visiting. Her name was respected in business circles, and people spoke of her with admiration, not because of her father's success, but because of her own. That year, her company hosted its annual charity gala in New York, an elegant event filled with bright lights, music, and laughter. It was one of the biggest nights of the year, and Emily attended not as a guest, but as the face of the event, confident, graceful, and proud of everything she had built. As she walked through the ballroom, greeting guests and donors, she noticed someone near the back of the room, a familiar face carrying a tray of champagne glasses. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But when he turned, their eyes met. It was Michael. He froze, unsure what to do. The once confident man she had married now stood quietly, dressed in the black uniform of the event staff. His eyes were tired, filled with regret and something deeper, shame. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the gala faded in the background. Emily took a deep breath and walked over to him. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor. When she reached him, she smiled, not with pride or anger, but peace. "Hello, Michael," she said gently. He swallowed hard. "Emily, I didn't know you'd be here," he said quietly, looking down. She tilted her head slightly. "You're working hard," she said, glancing at the tray in his hands. "That's good." He nodded, struggling to find words. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything." Emily looked at him for a long moment. There was a time when those words would have broken her, when she would have begged to hear them. But now they didn't carry the same weight. She simply smiled again and said, "Thank you. You taught me what strength really looks like." Michael's eyes glistened. "You look happy," he said softly. "I am," she replied. And she meant it. With that, she gave him one last look, not of pity but of closure, and walked away. The cameras near the stage flashed as she stepped into the spotlight to give her speech. This time, she didn't shy away from the attention or hide behind anyone else's name. She stood tall, her voice steady, her heart calm. That night, as she looked out over the crowd, she realized something powerful. She didn't need revenge, apologies, or explanations. The real victory was the life she had built, one filled with love, dignity, and purpose. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't destroying someone. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be. And as Emily left the gala under the bright city lights, she smiled to herself, not because she'd won, but because she was finally free.